Coming up, countdown to Donald Trump's return to the White House. And look at how his second term may impact Black Americans. And the National Urban League's plan to hold the Trump administration accountable when it comes to policy, economic opportunity, and social justice. That's all ahead on this half-hour edition of Here and Now. When President-elect Donald Trump returns to the White House, how will his second term impact Black Americans? Will marginalized communities suffer in the wake of some of his aggressive campaign promises? Joining us today to offer some insight is attorney Jennifer Jones Austin, CEO and executive director of the Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies, and conservative political analyst Robert George. It is so great to see both of you again.
To be here.
My producer is telling me I'm chit-chatting too much with you guys, so we have to get to work here. Mr. Trump will take office, and we know what a first term looked like. Both of your perspectives on what you think that second term is going to look like, based on what you've seen, what he's promised, as well as some of his cabinet picks. I'll start with you, Robert.
As we saw in the first term, there's sort of a bifurcation between what Donald Trump sometimes will promise and then the sort of chaotic element that he imposes himself, which sometimes infuriates even some of his supporters because they feel that he can get in his own way. And we saw that in the last few days, where instead of talking about serious policy stuff like the tax cuts that he wants to put through, or the immigration, his immigration policy, he's talked about aggressive deportation. Instead, we're hearing about let's annex Canada and Greenland and goodness and change the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America and all this other kind of stuff. And it just starts to kind of get it gets distracting. I think his supporters this time, which by the way, the Republican Party is certainly more united now than it was 8 years ago in 2017. He has almost complete support within the Congress, even though it's very, very narrow in the House. So the support is there. The question is he going to be focused on it? And we're certainly looking at his picks. I would say Tulsi Gabbard, head of DNI, Pete Hegseth, the Defense Secretary, and Kash Patel at FBI. Those are probably the ones that are going to get the most scrutiny. Though I would say 90% of his picks will get through. One or two of those three, I think, are in some serious trouble.
Okay. Jennifer.
Yeah, so I'm going to just piggyback on your statement about what we have seen, the disconnect sometimes between what he says and what he ultimately does. That said, there's some things that he has to do in 2025. One of them is he's going to have to address the tax code. The tax cuts that he put in place in 2017 are set to expire in 2025. Many of the people who brought him back to the White House want to see those tax cuts continue. They want to see them deepen. Now, if he goes forward, as he's talked about doing, by deepening the tax cut, the corporate tax cut, the tax cut that would benefit people making significantly more money than those who make significantly less money, the higher income, the wealthy versus the low income. The impact is going to be felt most deeply by lower income Americans, disproportionately Black Americans. We have to keep in mind that still today, Black Americans disproportionately represent those who are earning minimum wage, those who are still subject to what we call occupation segregation, working in jobs that pay less wages. If he goes through with the taxes as he's talked about them, they will be taxed at a higher level, and those on the higher end will be taxed at a lower level. They will see less in terms of their take home. That has a direct impact on how they live, how they function day to day. And already they're struggling.
One of the interesting elements in this, though, is in the context of this new election is that Donald Trump has created something of a newer coalition where he's gotten more votes from, broadly speaking, working class Americans, including more African Americans, including more Latinos, more Asians, and so forth. So, given that is, yes, his base is still, primarily Caucasian, wealthy individuals, and so forth. It's a broader coalition. It's a more economically heterogeneous coalition. Mm-hmm. So he's going to have tensions on that in terms of how he's going to improve job prospects and so forth.
But remember, he can't. Well, as of right now, he can't run again. So
this is quite true.
I saw that caveat.
That's it, as of right now, yeah.
Do you expect that slightly broader coalition? I think the U.S. News and World Report said about 16% of Black Americans voted for Trump this time around. Yeah. So he got
which is the most going back to I think Ford in 1976. Yes.
Do you expect some of those folks to have buyer's remorse?
I think it's way too early to say. A lot of it was a reaction to the frustration with increased inflation and things of that nature. But yeah, I mean, I think we'll see how it plays out. I mean, the main focus is going to be economic returns, job opportunities. That's the thing that people are going to be focused on.
The interesting thing, though, I'm sorry to cut you off. You'll get your chance. Even not too long after being elected, and at the end of December, he was talking about the fact that, once prices go up, it's hard to get them down. I mean, even then he was walking two steps back from what he had campaigned on.
Absolutely. And one of the things that, I'll just quickly share, we've done some work at the organization that I lead centered on the cost of living. And what we've been looking at and appreciating working with the nationally renowned Urban Institute is that what we really have, the problem that we have in America is that resources have not kept up with costs. Costs always go up. But if your wages haven't gone up, your assets haven't gone up, your wealth hasn't gone up, income supports haven't, you're not going to be able to cover your costs. What we're going to see with Donald Trump, if he follows through on some of the things that he's talked about, if he's going to engage in mass deportation, that's going to cost. That's going to cost in the billions. Where is he getting that money from? If he's going to cut taxes, then that's going to erode whatever monies he would have available. So what he's going to have to then do is turn and look at spending, right? And so he's going to have to cut discretionary spending, which maybe looks like Pell Grants, looks at defense spending. You may look at the federal salaries. He's going to have to cut there. And a lot of people who hold those jobs will be Black Americans.
Well, no, I was going to say, but one of the things he has, that Republicans have promised, is to do some of that cutting, particularly on the federal level, and he's talked about getting aggressive against the civil service rules. These are things that have been in place for 50, 60 years, mm-hmm. and frankly, may very well be in need of some reforms.
Is it your feeling that people of color, a lot of them are in agreement with this sort of aggressive stand on immigration because they've bought into that somehow immigrants are competition for them taking their job? It's
Many have. And the challenge that presents is that we're not really looking at what really is the crux of the problem. So again, I go back to costs and resources. And one of the things that I want us to appreciate is as we come up, as we now soon will be celebrating Martin Luther King Day, is that Martin Luther King Jr. talked about how, when people start coming together and coalescing, right? And he talked about Pharaoh and the slaves. Mm-hmm. He said what Pharaoh would do was pit the slaves against one another, right? So, look over and see that your fellow slave is doing something that's harming you rather than looking at what Pharaoh is doing. And that is what Donald Trump has done so successfully. The fact of the matter is that immigrants in New York and across the nation actually pay taxes. And those taxes fund a lot of the government spending that benefits many people. If they're kicked out, what's going to happen to that tax base? So I think to answer your question, I think people have bought into that, looking at othering, trying to figure out why do I why am I so burdened? Rather than looking at, well, what is the government doing on the whole to address my economic situation?
That's quite. I mean, I think that's a fair point. And look, I say this as an immigrant. I was born in Trinidad, moved to England, came to this. I've been in the United States for more years than I'd like to talk about right now. So I believe in a strong legal immigration, legal immigration policy. However, over the last few years, the border policy got shattered. We saw some of the impact of that here in New York with migrants, and I think it's not completely unfair, for Americans who are living here, African Americans including, to say, well, why are so many of our resources now going to those who didn't come to into the country by legal means, by regular means? And unfortunately, we're seeing horrific crimes that are committed by illegal immigrants, some who have been deported once and then sneak back in and do. So I don't think it's completely a case where, as to use your phrase, Pharaoh is pitting slaves against each other. I think it's a fair and understandable reaction to seeing people who were not supposed to be here committing some crimes and then seeing resources going to others that should be.
I appreciate the point, but I think it's an exaggerated point, and it's presented as though
it's not a non-existent.
No, and I'm not saying that at all. But what I'm saying is that when you make that the reason why Black Americans are struggling, that is a false narrative. That is not the reason. Black Americans have been struggling financially well before we had a crisis at the border. The fact of the matter is that Black Americans have not seen their wages and their wealth rise significantly. We're going back 50, 60 years now. And so when you say, well, it's because of the immigrants, you are actually setting up a false.
It's not because of the immigrants, but when you have an added problem to a system, when you add a new problem to a systematic one, it does create these natural tensions.
That is fair.
But it also gets you focused again on the other.
That's right.
Instead of the fact that I keep repeatedly giving tax cuts to the richest among us when that money could make a difference for all of us. And it would only be them paying their fair share, equivalent to what the rest of us po folks pay.
That's exactly right.
Can I ask you, going forward, that last term was chaotic. At best. But it's going to be a little bit different this time around. He's appointing loyalists, folks that aren't, perhaps many of them maybe haven't done it before, but they're loyal to him. How do you think that will impact especially communities of color and marginalized communities? I mean, you exit lots of people that are loyal to him, not to the American government, not to the American people, not to the way things have been done forever, to how he wants them done. And we've already experienced sometimes how he wants them done is sort of you're scratching your head.
Let's add, not only will we see that with respect to appointments, but now we have a Congress that has demonstrated that they too will be loyal. And so, people say, oh, we've experienced this before. We've seen, we've had Donald Trump 1.0. We know how to handle Donald Trump 2.0. I think it has the potential to be worse because loyalists aren't necessarily centered on what's good for America, for Americans. What do I need to do to stay in the good graces of Donald Trump? And you'll see that at the congressional level as well. We saw that when it looked like we were going to run into problems with the spending bill, right? Well, let's just kowtow and let's lean in and get in line. It can be hugely problematic. And now they know a little bit more about what they're doing.
Yeah.
We do, however, have the narrowest House majority in about 100 years. It's like 217 to 215. That means if one member is sick, for example, a vote is not going to pass. As you said, we saw on the spending bill, there are tensions. There are probably anywhere between 10 to 20 Republicans who are not on board with some of the spending because they feel it doesn't go far enough, which forces the House to negotiate with Democrats. So it'll be interesting to see how your side, how the Democrats will negotiate these and try and take advantage actually of some of these Republican
I think
tensions.
I'll just add that I think we're going to have to look at what are people thinking, happens in 4 years after Trump, completes his second term. If he doesn't get a third term, God forbid, right? Then you may begin to see people looking at him earlier on as, what is referred to as like a lame duck.
Lame duck, yeah.
Right? And so they may start to step away from him sooner rather than later.
Because Republicans are going to be up for re-election 2 years from now.
Right.
Donald Trump is not going to be on the ballot in either 2026 or 2028, and so it becomes every man or woman for themselves.
All right, Robert George, Jennifer Jones Austin, interesting discussion. We got to have you guys back.
Absolutely.
3 months into this new term, we'll take a look at what's happening. Thank you so much.
Look forward to it. Thank you.
We'll be right back.